It started with the creaking. Late one night, as Sarah sat in her small, dimly lit apartment, proofreading a manuscript for work, she heard the faint, uneven creak of wood beneath her. At first, she thought it was the building settling. Old buildings did that. But then the creaking moved, tracing a deliberate path from the far end of the room to directly beneath her feet. She froze, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Probably just the neighbors, she muttered, even though she knew the apartment below hers had been vacant for weeks. She shook her head and got back to work. The hours ticked by until, exhausted, she climbed into bed, leaving the faint creaking as a distant memory. But that night, she dreamed of whispers. They weren't coherent, just a jumble of voices, soft, insistent, almost pleading. When she woke, the whispers echoed faintly in her ears, and the floor beneath her bed felt colder than usual. The next day, Sarah shrugged it off. She was overtired, her workload was mounting, and she hadn't been sleeping well. By evening, the incident was nearly forgotten as she sank into the couch with her laptop. That's when she heard it again. This time, it wasn't just creaking. There were faint thuds, like soft knocks coming from beneath the floorboards. She leaned down, her ear nearly touching the cold, wooden planks, and listened. A whisper. She jerked upright, her heart hammering. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. The apartment was still, save for the low hum of her refrigerator. For hours, she tried to focus on her work, but the whispers continued, soft and indistinct, seeping into her consciousness. By midnight, she was pacing the room, every nerve on edge. Finally, she grabbed a flashlight and a screwdriver. The trap door to the crawlspace was hidden beneath an old rug in her kitchen. She'd never opened it. She didn't even know why it was there. But tonight, curiosity and fear pushed her to act. The hinges squealed as she pried the door open, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness below. The smell hit her first, a damp, earthy odor, tinged with something metallic. She gagged, but peered closer. The crawlspace was cramped and lined with old wooden beams. And then she saw them, marks carved into the beams, crude symbols and scratchings that looked like they'd been made with fingernails. Her flashlight flickered, and she felt the air grow heavier, as though the darkness itself was pressing against her. Just as she was about to close the trapdoor and forget she'd ever looked, something moved. It was barely a shadow, shifting in the corner of the crawlspace. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the air around her. This time they were clearer. "Help us!" The words chilled her to the bone. She stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking. No response. The shadow darted toward her and she screamed, slamming the trapdoor shut. She dragged her kitchen table over it, her hands trembling, and locked herself in her bedroom. That night, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to seep through the walls, the floors, even her skin. She lay in bed, clutching her blanket, as shadows flickered in the corners of her room. By morning, Sarah was pale and shaking. Her apartment felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. She called the landlord, demanding an explanation about the crawlspace. He sounded uneasy. "Listen," he said finally. "That crawlspace is old. Older than the building itself. The last tenant complained about noises too, but I never found anything down there." "What happened to them?" Sarah asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "They moved out," he said after a pause. "In a hurry." That evening, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't live like this. She would seal the trapdoor, pack her things, and leave. But as she entered the kitchen, she froze. The table she'd placed over the trapdoor had been shoved aside, and the door was wide open. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to surround her, and then she saw them, hands, pale and skeletal, reaching up from the darkness. They clawed at the edges of the trapdoor, pulling themselves up. She backed away, screaming, but they kept coming. Figures emerged, twisted, hollow-eyed things with gaping mouths that whispered endlessly. They moved toward her, their movements jerky and unnatural. Sarah ran, but they were everywhere. The walls seemed to ripple with shadows, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. She tripped and fell in the living room, and when she looked up, they were above her, staring down with empty eyes. The last thing she heard before everything went black was a single whisper, soft and mocking. "Stay with us." The next tenant never noticed the faint creaking beneath the floorboards.